Our motivation primarily lies in critical animal studies. We have been taking the bull by the horn, as it were, through the lens of subjectivity, anthropomorphism, speciesism, evolution, extinction, and so on. We would very much welcome any inquiries after today's session regarding joining and getting involved with our group. Now, before I turn this over to Stuart Cheney, my fellow coordinator, there are a couple of housekeeping announcements just for the record. Firstly, it would be great if all of us could keep our microphones muted during Dr. Ritvo's talk. Secondly, we would like to inform you that this session will be recorded. So if you have any concerns regarding that, please let us know after the talk, and we will do our best to edit the video accordingly, if at all we decide to post or share it publicly. Lastly, we will have a Q&A session after the lecture, of course. Please click on the blue raise hand option at the bottom of your screen, and we will then request you to unmute your mic and ask your question to Dr. Ritvo. On that note, I once again welcome all of you to this session. I shall now turn things over to Stuart, who would introduce Dr. Ritvo and a couple of extremely important and supportive people. Over to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Raj. So while the enthusiasm and active participation of each and every member of our group is indispensable, it's also imperative that we mention the constant support and contribution that we received from two of our faculty members, Dr. Matthew Rawlinson, who himself works on animal studies, amongst other fields, and who we will be briefly hearing from at the end of today's session, and also Dr. Mary Helen McMurran. Without Dr. Rawlinson's encouragement and active involvement, we would not have been able to get this group together last year. Similarly, Dr. McMurran has been extremely kind and generous with her time. The planning of today's event would simply be impossible without her. Today, we at the Animal Studies Research Group have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Harriet Ritvo. For over 30 years, since the publication of her first groundbreaking and Whiting Award-winning monograph, The Animal Estate, Dr. Ritvo's research has been foundational to the work of scholars studying the history of human-animal relations and environmental history, both in the British context and more globally, including her third monograph, The Dawn of Green, Manchester, Thirlmere, and Modern Environmentalism. Some of her more recent research, and the topic of today's talk, concerns animal extinction. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harriet Ritvo.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And now I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so it looks right? Yes. So anyway, extinction is a timely and a controversial topic right now. And unfortunately, it's been timely and controversial for several centuries. That is not, of course, to say that the focus of contention has remained constant. At first, the main question was whether it happened at all. The issue was understood primarily at first in theological terms, and the negative answer was based on an understanding of creation that was similar to the one that subsequently underlay, and of course in some places now still underlies, the fundamentalist rejection of evolution. And the similar concerns also produced problems when explorers encountered exotic animals that bore no resemblance to those of the old world, and therefore that weren't mentioned in the Garden of Eden. Now, I'm not a theologian, far from it, but it's interesting to think about why, even or especially among those who are committed to denying the possibility of evolution, that the fact of extinction has subsequently been embraced. And actually, I don't think the answer lies in a preponderance of the evidence. For example, the Creation Museum, there are lots of creation museums actually in the United States. I mean the big one that's in Kentucky near the airport of Cincinnati. The Creation Museum now celebrates dinosaurs. They're heavily promoted on its website. There's a large dinosaur statue of, wait a minute. There we go. Of, I would say, an indeterminate dinosaur species that is in front of the entrance to the Creation Museum. And it also, dinosaurs also figure prominently in the dioramas of the Garden of Eden and of Noah's Ark. See, there you can see something like a stripy brontosaurus is going 2 by 2 into the Ark. And they're explained not as inhabitants of an unimaginably remote past, but as the recently vanished originals of the dragons that recur in folklore and mythology in many, many different cultures. Now, when I visited there a few years ago, the gift shop offered a t-shirt that featured a splendid image of a stegosaurus with the legend, "I was created on the 6th day." I'm really sorry, actually, that I didn't buy it. And the explanatory placards that are scattered throughout the museum all do address the issue of the dinosaur disappearance. If they existed in such numbers and varieties so recently, what happened to them? But the answers are rather, I would say, nonchalant. They just suggest that maybe, despite their presence on the Ark, that they all drowned because they were so big and heavy, or maybe we ate them. Now, the people who designed the exhibits and the explanations at the Creation Museum actually are scientifically sophisticated, albeit not members of the mainstream scientific community. That is, these placards provide reasonable potted summaries of things like the Big Bang and even of evolution, but they then dismiss them in a kind of "they say, but the Bible says" format. And in the 19th century, the analogously knowledgeable predecessors tended to express their doubts from within the scientific community, or at least from its margin. So maybe the best known of these, at least in retrospect, is a man named Philip Henry Goss, who is both a professional naturalist. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1866, and also a member of the fundamentalist Plymouth Brethren sect. So here's Goss. And then this is an illustration from one of his books about corals and anemones. So by the middle of the 19th century, it was clear that fossils were organic remains rather than the relics of human art, for example, as had been speculated earlier. But Goss's commitment to creationism led him to resist the conclusion that many species had once flourished and then disappeared. That is, that God had allowed any piece of his original creation to vanish. So Goss proposed an alternative explanation for the fossil record, even as it grew increasingly abundant and as its chronological stratification had become increasingly clear. So he said, God had created the earth complete with the fossils already buried in it in order to test the faith of latter-day investigators. Now, few people were persuaded by this argument, which he originally published in a book entitled Omphalos, and the reference is to Adam's non-functional navel, which Goss considered to be an analog to these factitious fossils. But anyway, but that theory, along with the autobiographical hatchet job that was later published by his son, the literary critic Edmund Goss, is largely responsible for his continuing reputation as an authoritarian crackpot. Anyway, it's interesting that such skepticism about the meaning of fossils and the possibility of extinction largely ignored evidence that could actually be observed. So in 1821, astonished miners had discovered numerous bones of hyenas, hippopotami, and other animals no longer found in Europe, they were still bones, not fossils, but they clearly demonstrated the possibility of radical change in the composition of a local fauna. And in some cases, they belonged to species that no longer existed in a cave in Yorkshire. And this is a cartoon of William Buckland, who was a naturalist, entering this cave and encountering extinct hyenas. And also, some local anthropogenic extinctions had not only been well recognized, but actually celebrated for centuries at that point. So the medieval elimination of the most exciting native wild animals in Britain, the wolf, the bear, and the boar, and here's a medieval boar hunt, was often cited as evidence of the superiority of British culture. And indeed, throughout the 19th century, colonial officials suggested that a similar process of elimination was among the benefits offered by British colonial rule. And a bit further afield, although not that much, the last aurochs, which is the ancestor of all the current domestic cattle breeds, it died apparently of natural causes in what is now Poland in 1627. So here is a skeleton of the aurochs. Now the aurochs had been described, living aurochs had been described as well as hunted and eaten by many observers, including, for example, Julius Caesar. And in its final years, it was actually understood to be endangered. As its number dwindled, it was the beneficiary of ultimately inadequate royal attempts to preserve it. So this meant that, as it wasn't the case with British wolves or boars or bears, that the approximate date of its final disappearance was noted, presumably the occasion of regret, but probably not of philosophical or theological upheaval. Now, not long afterwards, wild species with small ranges began to disappear after and because, I mean, this is a clear case of post hoc ergo propter hoc, because they had encountered Europeans. So 18th century examples include the Steller's sea cow, which is a kind of big manatee, and the bluebuck of southern Africa. The most famous such casualty, of course, was the dodo of Mauritius, which survived less than a century after being noticed by Dutch sailors in 1598. And there is the dodo in the Oxford Museum. As was the case several centuries later in New Zealand, as well as in many other islands, naive, I should say, and flightless birds proved easy prey for human hunters, as well as for introduced predators like cats and dogs, which along with pigs and rats, also ate eggs and destroyed nests. The solitaire, the dodo's only close taxonomic relation, and I should say they're both unusually large members of the pigeon family. The solitaire was indigenous to the nearby island of Rodrigues, met a similar fate in the 18th century, and this is a solitaire. In 1848, the British naturalist Hugh Strickland published the first comprehensive study of both species in English, which was entitled The Dodo and Its Kindred. And his introduction gives a sense of the conventional understanding of extinction at that point. He first noted that it appears highly probable that death is a law of nature in the species as well as in the individuals. But this internal tendency to extinction in both cases is liable to be anticipated by violent or accidental causes. And then he attributed the disappearance of both the species, the dodo and the solitaire, to what he identified as a novel cause, the agency of man. He went on to lament that after being speedily exterminated, so little evidence of them remained that although the birds were almost contemporaries of our great-grandfathers, they became associated in the minds of many persons with the griffin and the phoenix of mythological antiquity. Of course, this scarcity of evidence also accounts for the plumpness of the dodo drawn by Tenniel in Alice in Wonderland, And Strickland had a similarly fat dodo as the frontispiece of his book. And this has had to be revised recently on the advice of scientists. So although, and to go back to Strickland, although he regretted the disappearance of any race of organic beings whose progenitors colonized the pre-Adamite Earth, Strickland consoled himself by reflecting on the divinely ordered domination of man and the inevitable march of civilization. It was therefore, he concluded, the duty of the naturalist to preserve the knowledge of these extinct or expiring organisms when he is unable to preserve their lives. Like most early commentators on a similarly limited extinctions, he didn't attempt to criticize the agents of extermination. As has often been the case, the line between human and non-human animals was slight and permeable in practice, if not in theory. And so his elegiac yet disinterested response could also be inspired by vanishing humans. So when Darwin encountered the native people of Australia and New Zealand on the home stretch of his Beagle voyage, he listed most of the practical reasons for their diminishing numbers that historians recognize today, that is disease, displacement, and so forth. But his conclusion engaged a different level of causality. So this is what Darwin said in a resigned way, not a happy way, but still. He said, besides these several evident causes of destruction, there appears to be some more mysterious agency generally at work. Wherever the European has trod, death seems to pursue the Aboriginal. Now, the dwindling and disappearance of more populous and widespread species later in the 19th century sparked a different kind and degree of concern among the overlapping communities of hunters, naturalists, and conservationists, especially since, in addition to the spectacular decline of poster species like the passenger pigeon and the American bison, many of the animals that such people like to hunt were becoming harder to find. Sportsmen throughout the British Empire and also elsewhere had begun to realize that in the areas they frequented most heavily, their targets were apt to become scarce. The explanation that had served for decades, that the animals were retreating to the interior, wherever the interior might be, and so they somehow continued to thrive out of sight somewhere less accessible, became increasingly unpersuasive. That's not to say that the people most concerned with faunal depletion immediately pointed the finger of blame at their own enthusiastic predation. Often, if there were any still around, they blamed indigenous hunters for overhunting, or in areas that had attracted non-elite white settlers, they might decide to blame them. But as you can see from these pictures of Theodore Roosevelt's predation, and indeed, these are putting it mildly, that is, there's only one dead animal in each of these pictures, and there could be many more. The hunters themselves had plenty to answer for. But sometimes even the animals were held responsible for their own demise. It's only as a result of recent DNA analysis that the dodo has been reassessed, no longer fat and stupid, but muscular and well adapted to the Mauritian environment, at least until that environment was radically altered by humans. Now, the OED online definition, which I checked again just the other day, suggests that this outmoded understanding of the dodo remains current, at least in some quarters. It reads, an extinct bird formerly inhabiting the island of Mauritius. It had a massive, clumsy body and small wings of no use for flight. And then it goes on to give you the figurative sense, which is an old-fashioned, stupid, inactive, or unenlightened person. And this definition also includes a superseded species name Ditus ineptus, which makes the same insult in Latin. Someone needs to tell the OED that the current name is Raphus cucullatus. I suppose I could. Anyway, along the same lines, some people believe that the passenger pigeon disappeared as a result of a kamikaze mass drowning in the Great Lakes. And the thylacine or Tasmanian tiger, a marsupial carnivore, the last one of which died in captivity in 1936, although there are people who continue to see them in Tasmania even now. I know one person who says that. Anyway, the thylacine was viewed as an oddly formed and unintelligent creature unable to cope with the demands of modern life. But for the most troublesome and spectacular of these extinctions, it was hard to avoid giving credit where credit was due. The passenger pigeon population of North America had originally numbered in the billions, and well into the 19th century, they migrated in flocks so massive that they could darken the skies for days. This meant that they alighted in similarly enormous numbers to feed, at which point in the second half of the 19th century, they were netted by hunters and shipped to urban markets via the newly developed railroad system. And they also had a market among sportsmen who trapped them alive and then used them in trap shooting. But the danger to the species was belatedly recognized, and in the final decades of the century, several states passed laws to control exploitation of the flocks. But these rescue attempts came too late, and the last passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. And now she lives in the Smithsonian in Washington. Similarly, at the end of the 19th century, the survival of the North American bison, whose population had numbered possibly as much as 30 million, I should say, depended on a mere handful of individuals. And like the passenger pigeon, their abundance had previously elicited awestruck comments from early observers. Their decline was somewhat more gradual, since Indians had been hunting them for the fur trade since the beginning of the 19th century. But the combined impact of diseases carried through their range by domestic cattle and the intensification of commercial hunting after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed constituted the final threat. And this is like, people did this just for fun. Obviously, the train wasn't going to stop to haul these dead bison onto it. So they just left the carcasses on the prairie. As with the passenger pigeon, when the catastrophic diminution of the bison population became too obvious to ignore, an official rescue effort was mounted. And this time it came from the federal government. The US Congress established Yellowstone National Park in 1872, the first such park in the world, at least in part to protect what were thought to be the last surviving members of the species. A few more turned up later, but not very many. And the relative success of this endeavor probably doesn't reflect the fact that the US Army was in charge of it at the beginning. They don't have a great record as far as conservation is concerned. But nevertheless, although the survival of the species remained uncertain into the 20th century, there's no question now that there are a lot of American bison around. They're sufficiently numerous that buffalo burgers are widely available in places like Montana, and the meat of the beefalo, which is a hybrid between the buff bison and domestic cattle, is sold in many supermarkets as a leaner alternative to beef. Well, there's a bit of question about the survival, which I'll come back to later. These first examples of the threatened or actual extinction of widespread and populous species that clearly resulted from modern economic activity come from North America. And it's not surprising that some of the most dramatic 19th century collapses would take place there, because the continent is so vast and the settlement of the high plains and the mountain west proved so challenging that to some extent, the impact of the first contact operated as a kind of time delay. the US frontier wasn't declared to have disappeared until the census of 1890. But North America wasn't a uniquely perilous site for species whose numbers might have made them seem impervious to the pressures of human population and human enterprise. So at the same time that the numbers of the passenger pigeon and the American bison were plummeting, a very similar scenario was playing out in Southern Africa. Now, the most significant thing about the quagga, or quagga as it should be, but it's easier for me to pronounce it as quagga, so I will, may have been its disappearance. And again, it's because at first there were so many. In fact, in the early descriptions in the 18th century, their numbers were one of the main things people noticed. So Thomas Pennant, in the late 18th century, he said, like the common zebra, who, as you can see, they look a lot like, they lived in vast herds. Now, Pennant distinguished carefully between quaggas and plain zebras. He said that physically, quaggas were stockier and they didn't have so many stripes. And he thought morally, quaggas were braver. They were inclined to fearlessly attack marauding hyenas. And he thought they were both braver and more docile and tameable than zebras. So he thought that they had been designed by God, I guess, as the beast of draft or burden for Southern Africa. Now, his sentiments were not apparently widely shared, or at least the quaggas were not universally cherished. A century later, the entry in the Royal Natural History regretfully described these vast populations in the past tense, explaining that although the herds had been characterized as immense as late as the 1830s, over the intervening decades, they'd been completely or very nearly exterminated. As it turned out, even this gloomy accounting was optimistic. Of course, it's difficult to pinpoint the demise of the final members of a diminishing wild species, but subsequent consensus puts the disappearance of free-living quaggas in the 1870s. There were a few living in European zoos at that time, and it seems as though the last captive one died in Amsterdam in 1883. And this is one who lived a little before that in the Zoological Society of London. Now, the reasons for the quagga's disappearance were obscure. They hadn't been prized as game animals or as trophies, so colonial sportsmen, in fact, weren't responsible. And they had coexisted with the indigenous inhabitants of Southern Africa for centuries, if not for millennia. So instead, the quagga succumbed to a combination of economic pressures. For several centuries, farmers in the Cape had hunted them to provide food for African farm laborers. And as settlement expanded into quagga habitat, they were eliminated as unwelcome competitors with domestic livestock. In addition, during the 19th century, a commercial market developed for their hides. For some time, despite these multi-pronged assaults, the herds apparently remained vast, and then suddenly, or so it seemed, they just were gone. And by this time, the fact of extinction had ceased to surprise, and doubts about theological possibility had been laid to rest, at least in the minds of most people. The quagga was far from the first animal to disappear after close encounters with European adventurers or settlers, as I've said. But what made its likely and then soon certain extinction especially troublesome was the juxtaposition of rapid decline with large population, especially as it became clear that this trajectory wasn't unique. So across the British Empire, inspired by a mixture of conservationist feeling and the desire to ensure the continued availability of wild animals to shoot, game laws were enacted to protect designated species by limiting the age, number, and gender of individuals who could be shot, as well as hunting seasons, and in some places, who was eligible to apply for licenses. In 1900, Britain hosted a conference for representatives of all the European nations that had colonies in sub-Saharan Africa, and that resulted in the Convention for the Preservation of Wild Animals, Birds, and Fish, which they all signed, although subsequent British official grumbling suggested that it may not have been followed by much action on the part of most of the signatories. In 1903, a group of distinguished British zoologists, colonial officials, and sportsmen founded what was called then the Society for the Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the Empire. It's a society that continues to thrive, although it's been rechristened multiple times. At the moment, it's called Fauna and Flora International. So its succession of names reflects the changing politics of conservation in the 20th century. Now, these institutional initiatives came too late for the quagga, but there's always been some question about whether its disappearance had been exaggerated. Unsurprisingly, in view of their similarity to the plain zebra, sightings were occasionally reported. And ambiguities produced by both formal and informal nomenclature also contributed to this protracted uncertainty. Vernacular terminology tended not to distinguish between the quagga and its closest relative. So Afrikaner farmers and sportsmen referred to both quaggas and the still numerous plain zebras as quaggas, which is an allegedly onomatopoetic word that reflects the noise that they made. And when Theodore Roosevelt, who's visited South Africa in 1909, he used quagga in this general sense. He found them to be beautiful, and he said he never molested them, save to procure specimens for the museums or food for the porters who liked their rather rank flesh, which meant that he only shot 20 of them, as opposed to however many he might have shot otherwise. Now, actually, I'm going to skip these slides. When thinking taxonomically, however, most naturalists firmly differentiated between the quagga and the plain zebra. Pennant, who I referred to before, had poured scorn on some of his benighted colleagues who considered them a single species, with the quaggas the males and the zebras the females, or possibly vice versa. And so the quagga was officially designated Equus quagga in 1784. And I should say that the incorporation of an indigenous term into zoological nomenclature was actually a violation of nomenclatural protocol at that time. Anyway, the quagga was named in 1784. The plain zebra was named Equus burchelli after a naturalist named William Burchell in 1824, so 40 years later. This formal distinction lasted for a couple centuries, but the emergence of genetic analysis has suggested that their relationship was still closer. It's recently been decided that they're not separate species at all, but at most subspecies of a single species. The rules of biological nomenclature dictate that when two previously recognized species are combined, the earlier designation takes precedence. So at least in name, all living plain zebras, along with all of them that are preserved in museums, have become quaggas, or at least they become Equus quaggas. And depending on how the degree of difference between subspecies is evaluated, this taxonomic conversions may well call the extinction of the quagga itself into question. But of course, quagga enthusiasts and other nostalgic purists have not been satisfied with a purely linguistic solution to the extinction problem. Defined in their original restricted sense, quaggas have possessed more extinction since their demise than they did when they roamed the grasslands of the Southern Cape. Along with other such recent extinctions as the aurochs, they've attracted aficionados spurred by a combination of nostalgia, zoophilia, and romantic attachment to place. This is the same combination that often motivates rewilding movements. And advocates often argue, in fact, that the reintroduction of vanished species would aid in the ecological restoration of their former habitats. So neither the discursive overlap indicated by the revised zebra nomenclature nor the molecular overlap on which it's based has persuaded quagga fans that the elusive object of their desire has been in front of them all the time. But ironically, the newly identified proximity has seemed to bring the restitution of former difference within realistic reach. So in South Africa, the Quagga Project sponsors an elaborate program aimed at resurrection. The method applies the selection techniques developed by livestock breeders. So plain zebras, considered to be the most quagga-like, are mated with each other so that each succeeding generation resembles the vanished quagga more closely, at least to the human eye. As with many belated attempts to rectify past mistakes, it's hard to know whether seeing should be believing. Oh wait, no. And this is a few of the reconstituted quaggas, and you could see they do have less stripes. So I'll finish by looking at a couple of other revivification efforts. As I mentioned, the aurochs was the focus of a very early effort to stave off looming extinction. And since that effort failed, it has intermittently inspired retrospective longing. Sometimes this longing led people to indulge in wishful thinking. So this is from a 1556 bestiary, so by someone who might theoretically have actually seen an aurochs. And what it says at the top in Latin is, ignorant people call me, ignorant people call me a bison. Confusion between the extinct aurochs and the still extant European bison persisted even among some zoologists throughout the 19th century. And just to make clear, this is a European bison, and you can see what it looks like is not a cow. It looks like an American bison, which it is closely related to. So in 1847, a popular sporting paper excitedly announced that the London Zoo had received the most important addition that has ever been made to it, which was the aurochs, or European bison, part of the last remnant of this noble race, the sight of which will carry back the classical reader to the German wars of Rome and the paleontologist to the days of the mammoth and the mastodon. The language in this quotation also suggests that extinction or non-extinction might invoke a different set of non-zoological stakes besides the theological ones that I've already mentioned. So although the denotation of aurochs might vary, its connotation was always the same. The animal in question was invariably noble and rare, imposing and threatened. It was a representative, whether already extinct or on the verge of disappearing, of a wilder, stronger, nobler, and purer Europe. And the importance of this set of associations is also suggested by the aurochs' more recent fans. By the end of the 19th century, most people were clear that the wild aurochs was extinct, and that however engaging bison might be, they were something different. But that didn't mean that everyone was happy about this. In the 1920s and 30s, a couple of German brothers, Heinz and Lutz Heck, attempted to recreate the wild aurochs by breeding back, that is the same technique that the quagga resurrectionists have used, breeding back from various European cattle breeds that they identified as having retained characteristics that they thought were primitive. They proceeded separately. They were both zoo directors. One was based in Munich and one in Berlin. They began with different images of what the original aurochs had looked like. They chose different breeds as the basis of their reconstruction, and they nurtured them in somewhat different settings. That is, one in the zoo and one in pastures. But they both produced what they thought were aurochs, and each of them appreciated the other's accomplishments. People who observed them from a distance have been more critical, sometimes on practical grounds. That is, they both concentrated on superficial characteristics like color and horn shape, and also neither one of them kept careful records either of the original stock they used or the pedigrees of their so-called aurochs. But some of the criticism was political, since both brothers were ultimately associated with the National Socialist regime, and the symbolism surrounding this allegedly primordial European animal was readily incorporated into Nazi ideology. But although the reputation of the Heck brothers was greatly diminished after the Second World War, their cattle have continued to enjoy a kind of niche appreciation. Herds are scattered across Europe, mostly, I think, just because people like them. But in places like Oostvaarderplassen in the Netherlands, where there's an attempt to recreate a pre-agricultural landscape, they stand in for the aurochs themselves. And here are some so-called aurochs or Heck cattle in the Netherlands. An announcement of the arrival of a few of them in Britain about 10 years ago inspired a somewhat mischievous headline in the Times, which combined both sets of associations, that is the political ones and the prehistoric ones. So this was the headline: "A Shaggy Cow Story, How a Nazi Experiment Brought Extinct Aurochs to Devon." Actually, the Times was being restrained. Notices in other papers were more lurid in their stress on the cattle's alien origins and unsavory association. So here are some of them. And that wasn't the end of the story. The same herd reappeared in the news a few years later. The headline in The Independent shrieked, "Nazi super cows. British farmer forced to destroy half his murderous herd of bioengineered Heck cows after they try to kill staff." So here is the murderous herd. Their owner noticed, however, that they made very tasty sausages that tasted a bit like venison. So even in their disaggregated and processed state, they still retained a whiff of their alleged wildness. And the discrediting of the Heck brothers' efforts has not meant the end of efforts to bring back the aurochs, inspired by very similar understandings and values. According to the Taurus Foundation Current, the aurochs has always been at the very root of the whole idea of a continent called Europe. It is, in fact, our continent's defining animals. Using recent technologies, they've developed a breed called the Tar-Os, which is currently being introduced in various rewilding locations from Iberia to the Balkans. I visited one herd when I was in Croatia a few years ago, and they certainly had large horns, as you could see, and they were living in relatively unconstrained conditions, but they were not, at least in my interaction with them, especially imposing or ferocious. But just to close with another example of linguistic stasis combined with organismic volatility, with regard to the American bison, which is often cited as a particularly encouraging example of the successful rescue of a species on the edge of extinction, some question has recently arisen about exactly what has been preserved in order to be spared or not spared in the case of some of them. In a way, what genetic analysis has suggested with regard to the species is the reverse of what it has suggested for the quagga. That is, if the quagga may not be really gone, the American bison may not be really still here, or at least not all here. The genome of many of them turns out to include substantial contributions from domesticated cattle. As with the quagga and the aurochs and the less likely candidates for resurrection, such as the mammoth, the implications of this discovery, of course, depend on the weight attributed to genetic essence, since the animal's behavior and physical appearance have remained incontestably bison-like. So we might philosophize along with the Hoosier poet James Whitcomb Riley. Hoosier means someone who lives in Indiana. Anyway, he memorably said, "When I see a bird that walks like a duck and swims like a duck and quacks like a duck, I call that bird a duck." Or then again, we might not. Thank you. Now stop sharing. Okay.
So Raj and Stuart asked me to chime in at the end to provide a bookend, and the main thing I wanted to say was thank you so much to Dr. Ritvo for coming and giving us such a mind-bending and stimulating talk on this, at least here, very gray Thursday afternoon.
Gray here too.
And I also, I mean, I don't know whether this is Stuart and Raj's intent, but I think it's completely appropriate. I really wanted to thank both Stuart and Raj, both for the work they've done in organizing this event, which we have 21 people here, which is terrific. Thanks so much to you guys for organizing this event, and also for the work that you have done in getting the Animal Studies Research Group going. For those of you who are not members, it's a reading, at the moment is a reading group. It meets roughly monthly, decides on its reading ahead of time, and it's been a very helpful venue for me, and I think for its other members as well, to move into the booming field of animal studies. It's a real intellectual resource for me as a faculty member, and for graduate students. We all work together. And I hope it can continue and grow. It's really been Stuart and Raj's brainchild, their baby. They've really done the work to get it going and to get the faculty to provide resources for it. So we have hopes to have a conference possibly next year, and more speakers, I hope, as good as this one. So I did want to say thanks to Stuart and Raj for getting this going, and also to plug the group. If there is anybody on this, anybody here today who would like to be added to the mailing list for the Animal Studies group, feel free either to email me or Stuart or Raj, or if you don't have already, if you're not already a member, you may not have our email addresses. Feel free to just put your email address in the chat, and we'll make sure you get added to the list. So with that, Dr. Ritvo has very generously agreed to stick around in this virtual space and take questions. So I guess it's my job to moderate. Let me ask anybody who would like to ask a question to so signify by using the blue raise hand function. And I will call on people in order and ask you to unmute yourselves to ask your questions. Do we have anybody with a question? Did I see someone or not? Well, let me take, oh, here we are. Melanie, go ahead. Unmute yourself and ask a question. Melanie Byron.
Hi. So I just want to re-echo, thank you so much for that talk. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. There's just so many different things I've written down here that I'm going to have to read on more. But I was just before this reading your Animals in the Estate book, and you made clear this kind of comparison between blaming the sort of negative effects of animals. This is in reference to their breeding, or animals not breeding, as it were. And you kind of draw parallels between that and sort of sexual morality discourse, and sort of emphasizing how they would blame animals and reveal blames they had on women, and this sort of comparison between the fault of the animal and the fault of the human that's kind of off to the side. And it seems to me there's very overarching parallels between this extinction and sort of blaming the animal for its own demise with colonial expansion, and sort of the discourse that's still survives today of kind of blaming indigenous populations with their own genocide, rather, shifting the blame from the colonial expansion onto the bodies that are being extinguished. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk on that at all, if you saw this parallel, and if this is something you're considering in your research, this idea of who's to blame, and just ties to colonial expansion as a whole.
Well, I think there's no question that the analogies between people and other animals go in all different directions. But certainly when British colonizers encountered colonial situations with both people and wild animals, they tended to, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes they put the big division between the people and the animals, and sometimes they put the big division between them and the people, with the indigenous people, along with the animals. And of course, there's often a rhetoric of they didn't usually talk about people as wild, but they often talked about them as uncivilized. It's, you know, sometimes it went the other way. You know, you know, early encounters with great apes tended to put them taxonomically closer than they subsequently became. You know, you can see 18th century people talking about orangutans as though they were a kind of people. So it varies so much. It's hard to generalize. You know, it depends on the observer and also on the particular situation. You know, I mean, for one obvious thing, agriculture was recognized as on the way to civilization in a way that non-agriculture was not.
Thank you. Further questions, or maybe I will indulge myself and ask one quick question on my own account. I mean, please feel free to say if this question is just based on a completely wrong premise. But it's my impression, I mean, you began with the Creation Museum, the big Creation Museum, and it's my impression that contemporary creationists, contemporary resistance to evolution comes actually from a far more literal reading of Genesis than it was actually the norm in the 19th century. I mean, when Philip Goss published Omphalos, even believers were kind of appalled by it. I mean, I think, I can't remember who it was who said they couldn't accept that God would perpetrate a monstrous fraud. I mean, you know, there were lots of people in the 19th century who did not accept that there could be new species. I mean, even scientists said, well, there's no evidence. We've never seen a new species appear. And it did take a while. I mean, my sense is that, but Cuvier, who didn't accept transmutation of species, really, above all, made the idea of extinction acceptable. But the arguments about, you know, whether extinction happens or not don't seem to me to revolve in the way they do today about evolution around the question of, well, around the question of what the Bible said. I mean, you know, the representation of Adam and Eve sitting alongside dinosaurs, that seems like an late 20th century phenomena. And I guess I'm really just asking, why didn't the Victorians think that way? Why are they so much less literal minded?
Well, I guess just as now, I mean, although, I mean, I am not a theologian, but, you know, only some Christians are fundamentalists in that way. And that was true then also. And it was, you know, actually one of the things that I think is striking about the way that evolution, the way that the response to evolution manifested itself in the later 19th century. And of course, evolution was around as an idea for a long time before Darwin. As you know, his grandfather wrote a poem about it. But the fact is that, you know, of course, On the Origin of Species was controversial, but it wasn't that controversial. Mm-hmm. And by the time that Darwin died, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, you know? So it it's in a way reading back through the lens of current controversy. I mean, the Victorians were, from our point of view, unenlightened in many ways, but in this way, they weren't as unenlightened as they might have been, or at least many of them.
Yeah, thank you. I think Matthew Carter is next. Matthew, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
So, hi everybody. Thank you for your talk, Harriet. It was really, really fascinating to listen to what you had to say on extinction. Something that you discussed, which I thought was really interesting, was this idea of the placement of animals, not only in terms of geographical space, but also in terms of temporal space, and the distance that that might create between the viewer and the animal in question. To what extent do you think the location of animals within a broader popular and scientific discourse, within not simply space, but also time, has in some ways influences the ways in which the species is understood, and therefore attitudes and responses to a species that is perhaps under threat due to human activity? For instance, would that help to promote ideas of conservation, or would it help to condemn the animal to some sort of narrative of inevitable ecological change over time?
Let's see. I'm not sure I've understood your question properly. But I mean, of course, if they're under threat, that means they're not separated in time. That they're still around.
The idea being that, like, as you said with the auroch, for instance, this need to somehow recreate the auroch is the idea that the animal is somehow dislocated.
Well, I do think that not having to confront an animal I assume if there were still T-Rexes running around somewhere, nobody would want to transplant them into their backyard. But there is some sentimental expression of a wish to see a real T-Rex. And you can certainly see that to do with mammoth extinction, which is a frequent target of extinction, and actually a more plausible one for de-extinction than the quagga, because one of the indexes of how little anyone cared about quaggas until they disappeared was that remains of less than a dozen individuals still exist, just a few dried up old bones and skins. You know, like in comparison, even with the thylacine, I mean, I've been in the back room of a museum in Tasmania that was full of thylacine remains, more thylacines than remains of quaggas, even though there were never, I mean, a top-end carnivore is never going to be as numerous as a herd ungulate. But anyway, so yes, I think that being removed and threatened and in a way extravagantly in need of rescuing can make people disregard characteristics of a species that otherwise they would wish to observe from afar. Yeah.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Gave me a lot to think about. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I don't see any other blue hands, and I will say this is a strange medium for questions.
It is.
But seeing no further inquiries, Raj Stewart, do you want to say anything to wind us down? It's actually this one too.
Yeah, I think Josh has a question.
Oh, fire away! Great.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to ask a question if there's time. So actually my question was about the sort of end of the talk, and I'm wondering if in cases of backbreeding, do you see in your thinking, is there a model for success that would be ethical? And I would say, like, what would that historical consciousness be? And as a historian, how would you think about that? I mean, since you've seen some of these efforts in action and you've seen the animals, do you consider that a success? And what do you think are the historical and, let's say, ethical models for that?
Well, you know, I mean, these reconstituted aurochs are cows. And as far as being a cow goes, I mean, I mean, speaking for a cow or even a cat is something that I would say takes a lot of nerve. But you know, if I was a cow, I think I would rather spend my life running around in the hills in Croatia than spend most of it in a feedlot on the way to the slaughterhouse. It's, I mean, there's a lot of ethical discussion around, you know, the claim, in a way, the claim of a species on their own genome, the claim not to be hybridized. And I find it very hard to know how to think about that, especially since many species in nature do hide. I mean, after all, they don't know whether they're a species or not. And, you know, and we keep changing our mind about it. And many of them are perfectly happy to hybridize. In fact, I think that, you know, the Bos taurus, the cow DNA that is in most of these current American bison, some of it probably comes from intentional crossing of animals that were subsequently mixed with wild herds. But some of it probably was intentional on the part of the animals and the period of the open range before the cattle were all fenced in and before the bison had all disappeared. So, and also, of course, many human reservations about hybridization have, I would say, an uncomfortable resonance with historical concerns about human miscegenation. So I would say there's a lot to think about there. I'm certainly happy to let the animals do what they want.
Can I add to the mix? I mean, revival attempts, I mean, obviously the attempts to bring back the aurochs prefigure current, I don't know if it's been done yet, but speculation about bringing back extinct animals using their genetic material and any such, I mean, bringing back the mammoth, for instance, is seems now.
No one has done that, although there's lots of genetic material. I mean, because they're frozen. You know,
I mean, I think that I think it is now thought to be technically possible. It would involve mixing their genetic material with the genetic material with, I mean, implanting it into the egg of an elephant or a related.
Yes, you would have to have, and it would have to be an Indian elephant, not an African one.
Yeah. So the resultant animal would be a hybrid, but one produced by genetic manipulation rather than hybridization. How do you feel about that?
That, you know, that technology is not mature. I think there's been the one similar success that I can bring to mind is some kind of maybe antelope or gazelle that lived in Iberia, where they did manage to produce a fetus that came to term, but then died, you know, within a day or so. But, you know, even the sheep Dolly, who was a mad success, and she lived a fairly long time, but not as long as she might have lived, people say. And, you know, people know a lot about genetic manipulation. I mean, there is a class, I believe, at MIT where the students are told to create a life form, presumably not a sheep or something like that. But, you know, so there's that. But then the consequences of that, the kind of manipulation and I mean, and physical manipulation on a very small level that has to be done, I think are not under control yet or understood completely at all.
Thanks. Any other questions? Sorry to barge in like that. I just wanted to supplement Josh's question. Raj, Stuart, Matthew Carter. carry on. Matthew?
So, hi again. I don't really want to hog the stream. I feel that's a bit rude, but you just raised a really interesting discussion about de-extinction and sort of the ethical concerns surrounding the de-extinction of species, particularly how Harriet's sort of discussion there has built on what she was already talking about in terms of how real is a bison in North America if we consider the amount of what could be termed genetic pollution from domestic cattle. It's not a term I'm happy with, but I think it's a term that captures some of the thoughts and feelings and some of the fears surrounding this sort of thing. To what extent do you think that, therefore, this idea of animals performing in a particular way that we want them to act, particularly in terms of their physical form, in terms of the way we expect them to act in an environment, to what extent do you think that that is important in terms of the discourse surrounding rewilding? For instance, is part of our desire, or the general desire, to have a reconstructed aurochs instead of just simple domestic cattle, because we want something that looks like an aurochs and therefore we feel inhabits the space and time that we feel it should do?
I think the simple answer to your question is yes. You know, in a way, what you described at first is domestication. Of course, people are very fond of that, and it definitely has its points. But you know, just like there are people who like to, you know, climb tall mountains and then camp out on top of them and things like that, and they find that's preferable to sleeping in their warm beds. You know, there's a similar valorization, I should say, of wildness in animals. I mean, although also people like to project the other way. They like to pretend that their domestic cattle are wild. I mean, I've written a bit about that. Or they like to pretend that their domestic cats are little tigers. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Oh, by the way, it was an ibex, the clone species. Okay. It was the Pyrenean ibex, I think. But yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thank you again.
I'm not seeing any other blue hands. Raj, Stuart, do either of you have a question, or I mean, or we're now well past 2 o'clock. Don't want to shut anything down.
Yeah, I was actually trying to, since we don't have the chat option available, I was like trying to share my screen with the with our contacts.
Oh, that's a great idea. Sorry, I didn't realize we didn't have chat.
Really sorry about that.
Okay.
That's one of the burdens of being a host.
But I don't seem to be able to like share the thing. Stuart, could you just type it out somewhere? I don't see the share screen option.
I just need the contact information. 1 second.
It is possible that only the host has the share screen option.
I believe Stuart and Raj are co-hosts, but
yeah.
However, I'm sorry, I'm the one who made this problem by referring to that, by just assuming there was chat. I mean, anybody who would like to join the group can email Raj or me, Matthew Rowlandson, or Stuart Cheney. Our names are in the list of participants, and we are all available through the Western name directory. So if you are in Western, we should not be hard to find.
Yeah. Okay, on that note, I really want to thank Dr. Ritvo once again, and thank you, Dr. Rowlandson, for like moderating the Q&A session as well. It was great to have all of you, and especially thanks to all the brilliant questions that we received as well to keep the conversation going. So, and thank you once and for all to like come here. Stuart, do you have anything else to add? or we could just wind up here.
No, I would just also like to throw my hat in to say thank you for everyone that's done the work to make this all possible. Thank you again, Dr. Ritvo and Dr. Rawlinson. I really appreciate the work that everyone has involved.
And thank you all.
Thank you very much for coming.
Bye, everyone.